Is this some kind of joke? The question, sharp and dripping with contempt, sliced through the dry, percussive rhythm of the firing range. It was aimed like a weapon at the old man, a figure of quiet stillness in a world of controlled chaos. Sergeant Kyle Rask, the source of the verbal projectile, stood with his hands on his hips, his posture a carefully constructed performance of dominance. To his mind, which was a fortress built on the shaky foundations of insecurity, the old man's very presence was an insult. He was an anomaly, a glitch in the crisp, orderly matrix of military life. The range was a place for the young, the strong, the vital, men like him, not for stooped, silent relics who looked as if a stiff breeze might carry them away. Rask's world was one of rigid hierarchies and loud proclamations of strength, and the old man, with his faded civilian clothes and the profound, unnerving calm in his pale blue eyes, fit into none of his established categories. The old man, whose name was Arthur Jenkins, did not seem to hear, or perhaps chose not to acknowledge, the insult. He sat on a simple wooden bench, away from the main firing line, an antique rifle laid out on a soft cloth before him. His hands, gnarled and spotted with the cartography of more than 80 years, moved with a slow, deliberate grace, cleaning the weapon not as a task, but as a sacrament. Each pass of the oiled cloth over the walnut stock, each careful sweep of the brush through the receiver, was a motion of practiced reverence. Rask watched him for a long, simmering moment, his irritation mounting with every second of perceived disrespect. The old man's silence was a form of defiance, a passive resistance that Rask's fragile ego could not tolerate. He needed a reaction, fear, deference, an apology, something to validate the authority of the stripes on his sleeve. The omniscient narrator of this small drama could see into the sergeant's heart, a place where a deep-seated fear of being seen as weak masqueraded as aggressive confidence. He was a petty tyrant in a small kingdom of concrete and cordite, and Arthur Jenkins, by his very existence, was a challenge to his throne. He strode closer, his boots crunching on spent brass casings, the sound intentionally loud and intimidating. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Grandpa," Rask snapped, his voice a full octave louder now, ensuring he had the attention of the nearby soldiers. "This is an active firing range, not a retirement home. What are you doing here with that thing?" He gestured disdainfully at the rifle, an M1 Garand from a war his grandfather had been too young to fight in. It was a beautiful piece of history, of blued steel and aged wood, but to Rask's eyes, trained only on polymer and Picatinny rails, it was junk. Arthur finished his pass with the cloth, folded it with painstaking precision, and placed it on the bench. Only then did he slowly raise his head, his gaze meeting Rask's without a flicker of fear or anger. The look in his eyes was one of immense, ancient weariness, the look of a mountain that has endured 1,000 storms and is unimpressed by one more gust of wind. "I have permission to be here, Sergeant," Arthur said. His voice was a low, raspy rumble, the sound of stones shifting at the bottom of a deep well. It was calm, factual, and utterly devoid of the deference Rask craved. The use of his rank, while technically correct, felt like a subtle mockery in its very placidity. The lack of an emotional response was gasoline on the fire of Rask's insecurity. He felt his authority being questioned, not by a challenge, but by an utter lack of engagement. It was as if he were a buzzing fly and the old man was a granite statue. He needed to escalate, to force the man to acknowledge his power. "I don't care about your permission," Rask sneered, leaning in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking tone. "I'm the NCO in charge of this range, and I say you're a liability. That antique pop gun is probably a safety hazard. And you," he looked Arthur up and down, "you look like you could keel over at any second. So I'm telling you, pack up your little history project and get the hell off my range." Now, he stood back, crossing his arms, a triumphant smirk on his face. He had drawn a line in the sand. He had made his command clear. In his mind, the confrontation was over. He had won. The other soldiers on the line, a mix of young privates and seasoned specialists, watched the unfolding scene with a palpable sense of discomfort. They were a captive audience to a power play that felt fundamentally unjust. They knew Rask, knew his arrogance and his temper, but they also felt a strange, unwilling respect for the old man's unshakable calm. He was an immovable object, and their sergeant was an unstoppable force of petty grievance, and they were all about to witness the collision. The collision, however, did not manifest as Rask had expected. The old man did not immediately scramble to obey, nor did he offer a defiant retort. Instead, Arthur Jenkins simply held the sergeant's gaze for a long moment, a silence that stretched and amplified the tension in the hot, still air. Within that silence, a profound and sorrowful understanding settled in Arthur's mind. He saw the young man before him not as a monster, but as a child playing dress-up in a soldier's uniform, a boy so terrified of his own insignificance that he had to scream his importance at the world. Arthur had seen men like him before, in boot camp barracks and on bloody battlefields. They were often the loudest and almost always the first to break. This knowledge brought no satisfaction, only a deep, weary sadness for the boy's journey ahead. This internal assessment, this quiet act of psychological dissection, was a power Rask could not comprehend. The sergeant, misinterpreting the silence as stubbornness, felt a surge of rage. His authority was being openly flouted. He needed a new angle of attack, a way to dismantle the old man's infuriating dignity. His eyes fell upon the rifle, the object of Arthur's quiet veneration. If he could not break the man, he would break the man's totem. What's so special about this piece of junk anyway? Rask sneered, stepping forward and reaching for the Garand. He did not ask, he took. His hands, rough and dismissive, closed around the weapon, yanking it from its resting place on the soft cloth. Arthur flinched, not from the aggression towards himself, but from the profane violation of the rifle. It was an involuntary, almost imperceptible reaction, but Rask saw it and reveled in it. He had found a crack in the granite. He held the rifle up, handling it with a theatrical carelessness that was an insult in itself. He scoffed at its weight, mocked the traditional wooden stock, and worked the action with a jarring, metallic clang that echoed across the now silent range. "My God, it's a dinosaur," he declared to the audience of soldiers. "Probably saw action in the Civil War, Pops?" He was enjoying himself now, the center of attention, the master of this small, cruel ceremony. He turned the rifle over in his hands, his eyes scanning for any other flaw to mock. And then he found it. Carved into the steel of the receiver, just above the trigger guard, was a single, elegant word. The letters were worn smooth by the passage of time and the touch of a hand, but they were still legible. Rask squinted, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he prepared to deliver what he believed would be the coup de grace, the final, humiliating punchline. He read the word aloud, his voice dripping with sarcastic venom. "Echo." He paused for dramatic effect, letting out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Echo, you named your gun? Oh, that is precious. Did you get lonely in your old age and decide to give your rifle a name? What's it do? Whisper sweet nothings to you at night." He held the rifle aloft, turning to the other soldiers. "Hey, you guys hear that? The old man named his gun Echo. I guess when you yell at it, the insult comes right back at you." This performance of sarcastic humor was, in the sergeant's mind, a brilliant display of wit. It cemented his dominance and exposed the old man as a senile sentimentalist. He was blind to the dramatic irony he was creating, utterly oblivious to the sacred ground upon which he was stomping with his muddy boots. For Arthur, the sound of Rask speaking that name was a physical blow. The world around him began to warp and fade. The sneering face of the sergeant, the hard Texas sun, the sharp smell of gunpowder, it all dissolved into a white, swirling mist. The word, a key turned in a lock rusted shut for 70 years, had opened a door in his memory, and his soul was now tumbling backward through time, into a place of profound, cold, and echoing silence. The name was not a joke. It was a promise, a memorial, a ghost he had carried for a lifetime. And this ignorant, arrogant boy was now dancing on its grave. The pain of it was a quiet, internal agony, a fresh bleeding of a wound that had never truly healed. The firing range vanished, swallowed by a blizzard of memory. The blistering heat was replaced by a cold so absolute it felt like a physical presence, a malevolent entity that leached the warmth from blood and bone. Arthur was 20 years old again, huddled in a hastily dug foxhole in the nightmarish landscape of the chosen reservoir. The snow was not the gentle, picturesque powder of Christmas cards. It was a harsh, granular tide, driven by a wind that moaned like a lost soul through the barren, skeletal trees of the Korean mountains. The world was a canvas of white and gray, and the only color was the sudden, shocking crimson of blood on snow. Cradled in his arms was his M1 Garand, the very same rifle now being mocked in another lifetime. Then, it was not an antique. It was a lifeline, an extension of his will to survive. Its cold steel was a familiar, comforting weight against his cheek. Beside him in the foxhole was the source of the name, Private Leo Schmidt, a freckle-faced kid from Ohio who was all of 18 years old. They called him Echo because he had a nervous habit of repeating the last few words of any order given to him, a tic that had gone from being an annoyance in basic training to an endearing quirk in the crucible of combat. "We gotta hold this line, he would whisper, his eyes wide in the dark. He was brave, but he was terrified, and his quiet echo was a constant reminder that they were all just scared boys, a long, long way from home. The flashback sharpened, focusing with terrifying clarity on their last moments together. Their platoon was overrun, a tiny island of resistance in a sea of overwhelming Chinese forces. The night was a cacophony of bugle calls, gunfire, and the screams of dying men. They had been ordered to pull back, to consolidate with the main force in a desperate fighting retreat. As they scrambled from their position, a mortar shell had landed devastatingly close. Arthur was thrown by the blast, his ears ringing, his vision blurry. When he came to, he saw Echo lying in the snow a few feet away. There was a dark, spreading stain on his chest. Arthur crawled to him, the sounds of the battle fading into a dull roar in his ears. "Leo, Leo, stay with me," he yelled, his voice raw. Echo's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain, but he managed a weak, ghastly smile. "Gotta hold the line, Art," he whispered, a faint, gurgling sound in his throat. He tried to say more, but only a bloody froth appeared on his lips. Arthur knew it was over. The rest of the platoon was gone, swallowed by the chaos. The enemy was closing in. He could hear their voices, their boots crunching in the snow. He had a choice: stay and die with his friend, or obey the order, retreat, and live. Leo made the choice for him. With a strength born of desperation, he gripped Arthur's arm. His eyes pleaded, commanded. "Go," he rasped. "Go." It was his last word. Arthur hesitated for a heartbeat, his soul tearing in two. To leave was to survive, but it felt like a betrayal. But an order was an order, and a friend's last wish was a sacred vow. He scrambled away, leaving Leo Schmidt behind in the blood-stained snow, his final, faint echo lost to the howling wind. He never saw him again. He fought for another week, a ghost in the blizzard, fueled by grief and rage and a desperate, animalistic will to live. His Garand was his only companion. When he was finally rescued, a frostbitten, half-starved wraith, he was one of the few survivors of his original company. In the quiet aftermath, weeks later, he found a craftsman in a small Japanese village and paid him to carve a single word into the receiver of his rifle. It was an epitaph. It was a memorial. It was a promise that as long as he drew breath, Private Leo Echo Schmidt would not be forgotten. The memory faded, and Arthur was back on the bench, the Texas sun on his face, the ghost of the Korean winter still chilling his bones. As Arthur's soul returned from the frozen past, the drama on the firing range was escalating. At the edge of the concrete apron, partially obscured by a rack of target stands, a young soldier had witnessed the entire, ugly exchange. Private First Class Daniels was a quiet, observant young man, a third-generation Marine whose grandfather had served at Iwo Jima and whose father had fought in Fallujah. He had been raised on stories of honor and sacrifice, and his moral compass, forged by the examples of the men who came before him, was unerring. He did not know who the old man was, but he recognized the bearing. It was in the stillness, the almost preternatural calm in the face of provocation. It was the same quiet strength his grandfather had spoken of, the mark of a man who had seen the worst of the world and had emerged unbroken. Watching Sergeant Rask, a man he already disliked for his bullying tactics, humiliate this figure of quiet dignity, stirred a righteous anger deep within Daniel's gut. He knew the risks of intervening. Rask was his superior, and the chain of command was sacred. To challenge an NCO was to invite a world of trouble. But as Rask snatched the rifle and began his cruel mockery, another of his grandfather's lessons echoed in his mind. There are two chains of command, son. The one on paper and the one of character. When they don't line up, you follow character. Daniels made a decision. It was a risk, but his conscience demanded it. Slipping away from his post, he moved behind a large supply container, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He pulled out his cell phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He didn't call his platoon sergeant or his company commander. He knew this situation required a response from an authority that Rask could not possibly challenge or dismiss. He had a number, a break glass in case of emergency contact given to him by his father, who was now a colonel stationed at the Pentagon. It was the direct line to the base commander's aide-de-camp. The call was answered instantly by a crisp, professional voice. Captain Miller speaking. Daniels took a breath, keeping his voice low and steady. Captain, this is PFC Daniels. I apologize for the breach of protocol, sir. I'm at the main firing range. There is a situation here that requires immediate command-level attention. He quickly and concisely explained what he was witnessing. An NCO, Sergeant Rask, publicly harassing an elderly civilian veteran, confiscating his personal property, and creating a spectacle of profound disrespect in front of 24 junior enlisted soldiers. Sir, Daniels added, a note of urgency in his voice. This isn't just some disgruntled vet. The man carries himself differently. He has a quiet authority I've only ever seen in one other person, my grandfather, who fought in the Pacific. I believe Sergeant Rask is making a mistake of historic proportions. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Daniels held his breath, fearing he had overstepped, that he would be dismissed as a troublemaker. Then, Captain Miller's voice came back, sharp in all business. Describe the veteran and his weapon, Private. Daniels gave the description, the advanced age, the quiet dignity, the antique M1 Garand. As he mentioned the rifle, he heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by the frantic clicking of a keyboard. Understood, Private, Captain Miller said, his voice now tight with a controlled urgency. Your actions are noted and commended. Do not engage. Do not interfere. A command element is being dispatched to your location. ETA is 3 minutes. Stay out of sight. The line went dead. Daniels let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline coursing through him. He had just set in motion a force he could not control. He peeked around the edge of the container. Rask was still in full performance mode, parading the rifle around, basking in what he perceived as his victory. He was completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over his head. Daniels watched, his heart a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. The cavalry was coming. The first sign of the coming storm was not a sight, but a sound, a low, distant thrum of powerful engines moving at a speed that was fundamentally wrong for the carefully regulated environment of a military base. It was a sound of controlled aggression, of urgency that bordered on emergency. Most of the soldiers on the range, their senses attuned to the normal rhythms of their surroundings, heard it and instinctively looked towards the access road. Sergeant Rask, however, was deaf to it, lost in the sound of his own voice and the echo of his own perceived wit. His back was to the road, his entire focus on the final humiliation of the old man. The thrum grew into a deep, guttural roar. A cloud of dust erupted on the horizon, the telltale plume of a convoy moving with immense speed and purpose. From the dust cloud emerged 3 black, menacing SUVs, their tinted windows making them look like predatory beetles scuttling across the sun-baked earth. They did not slow as they approached the range. If anything, they accelerated. The soldiers fell silent, their attention now completely torn from Rask's sad spectacle. An unspoken question rippled through the ranks. Who is that? This was not a routine visit. This was an arrival. This was an intervention. Rask finally sensed the shift in the atmosphere. The silence of his audience, which he had mistaken for rapt attention, was something else entirely. It was awe, and it was fear, and it was not directed at him. He faltered mid-insult, a confused look crossing his face. He turned, following the gaze of his men, and his jaw went slack. The SUVs were now bearing down on the range, their destination clear and unmistakable. They bypassed the designated parking areas, driving directly onto the concrete apron in a flagrant, and shocking disregard for every safety protocol. They screeched to a halt in a perfectly synchronized maneuver, kicking up a spray of gravel, their formation a clear statement of disciplined, overwhelming force. The engines idled with a low, threatening growl. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with anticipation. Then, as if on a single command, the doors of all three vehicles opened. 6 imposing military policemen emerged, their movements economical and precise. They formed a silent, unbreachable perimeter, their hands resting near their sidearms, their expressions unreadable slates of professional intimidation. And from the rear door of the central vehicle, a figure emerged who seemed to draw all the light and air on the range towards him. He was a tall, powerfully built man whose uniform was so immaculate it seemed to have been forged from steel and starch. The silver eagles of a colonel were on his collar, but it was the single star on his patrol cap and shoulders that caused a wave of shock to pass through the assembled soldiers. It was General Morrison, the base commander, a man known for his combat record, his fierce devotion to military tradition, and his utter intolerance for incompetence. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His presence here, on this range, at this moment, was as surreal and terrifying as a hurricane making landfall in a teacup. He did not rush. He adjusted his uniform with a single, sharp tug and began to walk, his polished boots marking a slow, deliberate, inexorable path across the concrete. His eyes, the color of chips of ice, were not focused on the ranking NCO, Sergeant Rask. They looked past him, through him, and settled on the quiet, elderly figure of Arthur Jenkins. Rask stood frozen, the heavy Garand still in his hands, his mind struggling to catch up with the catastrophic reality that was unfolding. The world had ceased to make sense. He was no longer the author of this event. He was a minor, pathetic character in a much larger, much more terrifying story that was reaching its climax. General Morrison's approach was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Each step was a hammer blow against the crumbling edifice of Sergeant Rask's authority. The general's gaze remained locked on Arthur, a silent communication of respect and purpose that deliberately and pointedly excluded the preening NCO. For Rask, being rendered invisible by such an immense power was a punishment more profound than any verbal rebuke. He was an obstacle, a piece of furniture to be navigated around on the way to something important. He felt himself shrinking, his manufactured confidence evaporating under the cold, silent judgment of the general's passage. When General Morrison reached the bench, he stopped directly in front of Arthur, his posture one of perfect military bearing. The onlooking soldiers, who had snapped to rigid attention, held their breath, their minds reeling with 1,000 confused questions. What followed was a gesture so powerful, so contrary to the established order of the military universe, that it would be burned into the memory of everyone present. The general raised his right hand to the brim of his cap and delivered a salute. It was a gesture of breathtaking precision and profound reverence. It was slow, deliberate, and held for a long, silent moment, a public declaration of honor from the highest echelon of power to a humble, unknown civilian. In that single, electrifying moment, the entire power dynamic of the situation was not merely shifted, it was annihilated and rebuilt from the ground up. Arthur, who had risen slowly to his feet at the general's approach, met the high-ranking officer's eyes and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a quiet acknowledgement, an acceptance of the honor from one old soldier to another. The general then dropped his salute and his stern, commanding expression softened into one of genuine warmth and deep respect. "Art," the general said, his voice a low, powerful baritone that nonetheless carried across the silent range. "It is a profound honor to see you, sir. I apologize for my tardiness, and I apologize for the welcome you have received from my command." The use of the word "sir" was a second, verbal salute, a confirmation for all who were listening that this old man was someone of immense, hidden importance. The general then turned his head, and his icy gaze finally fell upon Sergeant Rask. The warmth vanished, replaced by a look of such utter contempt that Rask physically recoiled. Without raising his voice, the general extended his hand. "Sergeant," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Give me the rifle." Rask, his hands trembling violently, could barely function. He stumbled forward, almost tripping, and practically shoved the garand into the general's hand, desperate to be rid of the object that he now understood was the source of his damnation. The general did not take the rifle. He received it. He cradled it in his arms with the care one would afford a priceless and fragile artifact. He ran a hand over the worn stock, his fingers tracing the familiar lines. His eyes found the single carved word on the receiver. He looked at it for a long time, his expression a mixture of sorrow and reverence. "I haven't seen this old friend in 40 years, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Then he looked up, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of the soldiers, finally coming to rest on the chalk-white face of Sergeant Rask. The moment of revelation had arrived. The general was no longer just a commander. He was the keeper of the flame, the historian, the voice for a hero who was too humble to speak for himself. He took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the history lesson that would serve as Sergeant Rask's verdict and sentence. "This rifle," General Morrison began, his voice resonating with a cold, clear authority that commanded absolute attention, "is more than a piece of American history. It is a testament to a chapter of that history that was written in blood and ice. And this man," he nodded respectfully towards Arthur, "was the one holding the pen." The general's eyes bored into Sergeant Rask, pinning him in place with the sheer force of his contempt. "You, in your bottomless ignorance, mocked this weapon. You mocked the man who carried it. Let me educate you, Sergeant, so that for the rest of your hopefully short and insignificant military career, you will remember what true honor looks like." The general's voice began to build, taking on the powerful, rhythmic cadence of a eulogy. In the winter of 1950, at a place called the Chosin Reservoir, this man, then a 20-year-old corporal in the United States Marine Corps, was part of a force of 15,000 men who were surrounded and attacked by 120,000 enemy soldiers. For 17 days, in temperatures that reached 40 degrees below zero, they fought. They froze, they starved, and they died in numbers that would have broken a lesser force. But they did not break. They fought their way out, destroying 7 enemy divisions in the process. It is one of a handful of battles that defines the very soul of the Marine Corps. Corporal Arthur Jenkins was there. The story settled over the crowd, a heavy blanket of awe and shame. Rask looked as if he were about to be physically sick. The general wasn't finished. He held the rifle up slightly, so all could see the engraving. And this word, echo. You found it amusing. You used it as a punchline. You pathetic little man. You have no conception of the weight of the words you speak. His voice dropped, becoming thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. On the third night of the breakout, Corporal Jenkins' platoon was ambushed. They were pinned down, being cut to pieces. A young private, an 18-year-old kid from Ohio named Leo Schmidt, whose nervous tic had earned him the nickname Echo, stood up in the face of a dozen enemy machine guns to provide covering fire so his friends could get to safety. He was killed instantly. His sacrifice allowed 3 men, including Corporal Jenkins, to survive. Jenkins was the only one of the 3 to make it back to our lines. He spent the next 48 hours fighting his way through the enemy, alone, in a blizzard, carrying this rifle. When it was over, he had this word carved into it, as a promise that he would carry the memory of that boy's sacrifice for the rest of his life. This rifle, the general's voice rose again, thundering across the range, is not just a tool of war. It is a headstone. It is a memorial. It is a sacred promise between fallen brothers. And you, Sergeant Rask, you dared to treat it like a toy. You used it to humiliate a man who has more honor in his little finger than you possess in your entire being. The general took a deep, shuddering breath, his composure momentarily cracking under the weight of the story he had told. He had not just vindicated his friend. He had given voice to a ghost, resurrected the memory of a fallen hero, and in doing so, he had passed judgment. The reveal was complete, a blinding flash of truth that had exposed Rask's arrogance for the pathetic, ignorant thing it was. Arthur Jenkins, the unassuming hero, stood quietly, his history now laid bare for all to see. The general's powerful monologue hung in the air, the final, devastating notes of a symphony of vindication. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by a pathetic, choked sob from Sergeant Rask. The verbal evisceration was complete, but the official judgment was yet to be rendered. General Morrison's eyes, which had been filled with the fire of righteous history, now became cold, hard points of institutional authority. He was no longer the historian. He was the executioner. He took a slow, deliberate step towards Rask, who flinched and squeezed his eyes shut, as if bracing for a physical blow. The general's voice, when it came, was devoid of all emotion. It was flat, sterile, and terrifyingly final. "Sergeant Rask," he began, the title now sounding like a curse, "you are a disgrace. You are a stain on the uniform that better men than you have bled and died for. You have failed as a leader, you have failed as a soldier, and you have failed as a man. Your conduct today was not just unprofessional. It was an act of profound moral cowardice." Every word was a precisely aimed shot, dismantling what little was left of Rask's shattered ego. The general was not shouting. His quiet, controlled delivery was infinitely more devastating, forcing everyone to lean in and listen, making them all witnesses to the methodical deconstruction of a career. "You used your rank, a sacred trust, as a weapon to bully a civilian. You did so publicly, in front of your subordinates, thereby teaching them the worst possible lesson about leadership. That power is for tormenting the weak. You have fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of our entire organization. We are here to protect the helpless, not to become predators ourselves." He paused, letting the weight of his condemnation settle. "Effective immediately," he continued, his voice as sharp as breaking glass. "You are relieved of all duties. You are stripped of your rank. The chevrons on your sleeve are hereby declared null and void. You are no longer a non-commissioned officer in my United States Marine Corps." A collective, audible gasp went through the crowd of soldiers. This was a public, on-the-spot field demotion, a rare and deeply humiliating form of punishment. Rask's legs seemed to give way, and he stumbled, only catching himself at the last moment. "You will be taken from this range directly to the base stockade," the general stated, his voice unwavering. "You will be held there, pending a full Article 32 investigation. I will be recommending you for a general court-martial on charges of conduct unbecoming an NCO and dereliction of duty. I will personally see to it that you are dishonorably discharged from the service you have so thoroughly disgraced. Your time as a Marine is over." He turned to the MPs who had been standing by, silent and imposing. "Captain," he commanded, his voice ringing with finality, "take this private into custody. Get him out of my sight." The MP captain stepped forward, his expression grim. He placed a hand on the arm of the now sobbing Kyle Rask. The rebuke was absolute. The tyrant had been deposed, his authority dismantled, his future erased. Justice, swift and terrible, had been delivered in the hot Texas sun. As the MP captain began to lead the utterly broken Kyle Rask away, a quiet voice interjected, calm and measured, yet carrying an authority that stopped everyone in their tracks. "General." It was Arthur. He had remained a figure of stoic stillness throughout the general's tirade, a silent witness to his own vindication. Now, he spoke, and the entire assembly turned to him. His eyes were not on the general, but on the back of the young man being led away. There was no trace of malice or triumph in his expression, only a profound and weary compassion. "Let him go," Arthur said simply. The general turned, his face a mask of disbelief. "Arthur, this man's actions were inexcusable. He must be held to account. The integrity of the institution demands it." "He has been held to account," Arthur replied, his voice still quiet but firm. "You did that. You took his pride, you took his rank. He's been broken in front of his men. What more can a court-martial do? Humiliate him further? Cast him out. The boy is a fool, but he is not evil. He is just young." He then turned his gaze directly to Rask, who had stopped and turned back, his face a mess of tears and confusion. "Son," Arthur said, and the word was not condescending, but almost paternal. "A man's character is not measured by how he treats his superiors, but by how he treats those he has power over. Remember that. Learn from this. Don't let this mistake be the end of your story. Let it be the beginning of a better one." This act of grace, this lesson in humility offered from the victim to his tormentor, was the final, stunning twist in the day's drama. It was a demonstration of strength so profound that it dwarfed the general's thunderous display of power. It was the strength of forgiveness, the wisdom of a man who had seen enough hatred and violence to last a dozen lifetimes and had chosen a different path. General Morrison stared at Arthur, his own righteous anger slowly receding in the face of his old friend's immense moral certainty. He had fought for justice, but Arthur was fighting for redemption. After a long, silent moment of internal conflict, the general nodded, a gesture of deference to a higher authority. He looked at the MP. "Release him," he commanded. Then his eyes, still hard as diamonds, found Rask. "The court-martial is withdrawn," he said, his voice clipped and formal. "But the demotion stands. You are Private Rask. Your reassignment orders will be on your bunk by tonight. You are being transferred to the Wounded Warrior Battalion. You will spend your days emptying bedpans, reading to men who have lost their sight, and listening to the stories of warriors who have given parts of themselves for their country. Maybe, if you're lucky, some of their character will rub off on you. Now get out of my sight." It was not the end Rask had faced moments before, but it was a different kind of sentence. It was not a cage of steel, but a crucible of character. Arthur's grace had not erased the consequence, but had transformed it from a punishment into a penance, a chance for a broken man to perhaps, one day, be made whole again. Months later, in the quiet, sterile corridors of the Wounded Warrior Battalion barracks, a different Kyle Rask moved with a humility he had never known. The arrogance had been scoured from him, replaced by a somber respect born from daily proximity to true sacrifice. He had spent his days in the company of heroes, men his own age and younger who were grappling with catastrophic injuries, and he had learned the lesson Arthur Jenkins had intended for him. He had listened to their stories, shared their pain, and in doing so, had begun to understand the true meaning of the uniform he still wore. His work was difficult and often heartbreaking, but for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with rank or authority. One afternoon, he was told he had a visitor. In the common room, he found Arthur Jenkins sitting quietly in a chair, looking out the window at the gardens. Rask's heart leaped into his throat. He approached the old man slowly, his steps hesitant. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, his voice soft. "They told me you were here." Arthur turned, a gentle, welcoming smile on his face. "I visit every week," he said, "just to talk. It's good to listen." Rask stood awkwardly for a moment, the apology he had rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times suddenly feeling inadequate. "Sir," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I never properly thanked you for what you did. You could have let them destroy me, and you didn't. You gave me a second chance." Arthur's smile widened slightly. "Everyone deserves a second chance, son," he said. "It's what you do with it that defines you. From what I hear," he gestured around the room at the other wounded Marines, who nodded respectfully in Rask's direction, "you're doing all right." A wave of gratitude and relief so powerful it almost brought Rask to his knees washed over him. He had not been forgotten, and he had not been condemned. He had been given a path, and he was walking it. They sat for over an hour, the old hero and the humbled young private, and they talked. Arthur did not lecture or preach. He simply told stories of Leo Echo Schmidt, of other friends lost, of the quiet life he had built after the war. He spoke of honor not as a grand concept, but as a series of small, daily choices. It was the greatest lesson in leadership Kyle Rask had ever received. As Arthur prepared to leave, he placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You're going to be a good man, Private Rask," he said. And in that moment, Rask believed him. The cycle of humility, grace, and redemption was complete. The quiet hero had not only won his own vindication, but had salvaged the soul of his adversary. This story is a testament to the fact that our veterans carry more than just memories of war. They carry wisdom, grace, and a deep understanding of what truly matters. They are living history, and they deserve our utmost respect and attention. Their battles may be over, but their lessons have the power to change our lives for the better. If you were moved by this modern parable of honor and redemption, please consider liking this video and sharing it with others. Subscribe to our channel for more inspirational stories that celebrate the quiet heroes who walk among us. Every view, every share helps to ensure that their legacies and the lessons they have to teach us are never forgotten.